you've been playing video games for a while, chances are you've heard tell of the once revered studio Rareware. Though many of their early projects were solely for the European PC market and arcades, Rare would rise to fame and become a veritable force in the video game industry after teaming up with Nintendo to breathe new life into Donkey Kong with their Donkey Kong Country series. And from there, Rare would, for a short time, become known as the Renaissance men of game development, with games spanning almost all genres, from platforming to fighting to racing and even first-person shooting. And while not every game was a home run hit out of the park, most of their variety-filled efforts would go down as classics, or at least classics for the time. But fast forward to present day, and Rare isn't much more than a shadow of its former self. After being bought out by Microsoft back in 2002, many of the original development teams would leave to pursue other efforts or form their own studios. And while Microsoft has tried to get some unique and interesting ideas to come out of Rare under their umbrella, it's rather unanimously agreed by fans that Rare's best days were working as a second-party studio for Nintendo. Thankfully though, the power of Kickstarter was able to bring together a handful of seasoned ex-Rareware staffers to form a new studio called Playtonic Games. And their first project would be an homage to their classic N64-era 3D platformers, most specifically the Banjo-Kazooie games. And that's what Yooka Laylee is. It's a very obvious spiritual successor to a series that its own developers once helped create. On paper, it seems like an instant recipe for success, but when put into action, it seems that player opinions on the end result have been very mixed. And this, surprisingly, isn't the only notable instance of a spiritual successor not living up to the on-paper nostalgia-driven ideas it was trying to sell in the first place. So first, I'd like to take a look at Yooka Laylee and see if I can explain why, despite my own personal general enjoyment of the game, that it was met with such a mixed bag of reactions despite the fact that its Kickstarter was one of the most successful ones out there. And then I'd like to take that and discuss the fine line between what does and doesn't make a good spiritual successor. So sit back, relax, and put on your nostalgia goggles because we're headed back to the 90s. So, Yooka Laylee is a 3D platformer, but that might not mean much to many gamers these days, because the only really successful 3D platforming series out there that's kind of stood the test of time has been the Mario series. And when I say successful, I mean that Mario has seemingly outlasted his contemporaries. Now, hold on. I can already hear the fans of other shorter-lived or just generally smaller 3D platforming series lighting up their torches and pitchforks to come after me, and believe me, I am with you. I love the older Crash and Spyro games, Ape Escape is underrated as all hell, Sly Cooper is a pretty damn cool game as well and how it incorporates its stealth mechanics, and despite the fact that I'm not exactly the biggest fan of it, I don't think I could get past this video safely without at least acknowledging the long-running and action platforming hybrid series that is Ratchet & Clank. Now, while each of these series that I've mentioned may have plenty of great games in their own right, they still don't end up matching up to Mario in the sales department, and from the business side of things, even though I'm just an armchair CEO at this point, that's why we tend to see less of them, while Mario seems to kind of just move on untouched. Anyways, now that I've covered my own ass, enter Yooka Laylee, a game so blatantly trying to be the next Banjo-Kazooie that the only reason I think people haven't exactly knocked on the game for that is because they kind of know that the ex-Rare staffers who put the game together really don't have a choice in the matter, and don't have access to the Banjo IP anymore because it's locked within the bowels of Microsoft, so the extremely obvious copycat style kind of gets a free pass. Also, Banjo's last outing was 9 years ago, and that was in Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts on the Xbox 360. A game that, while not awful, really just left a horrid taste in the mouths of anyone wanting a big new 3D Banjo platformer game, because that just wasn't what we wanted. So at this point, blatant similarities in appearance aren't exactly going to be a massive point of criticism. I know I'm starting to get a bit long-winded here though, so I'll break my talk on Yooka Laylee in two parts. I'll point out the good stuff and then the not so good stuff, and we'll jump off from there. So, at its best, I think what's good about Yooka Laylee is that it's a solid throwback to the golden age of 3D platforming. There's a lot of big and diverse levels to explore, all of which are unique and differ greatly from each other in aesthetic and design. There's plenty of lighthearted humor and goofy characters who do all need some sort of favor, but hey, in the end, they give up the magical MacGuffins you're trying to collect this time around. And I felt that the game controlled pretty well, and offered you a good arsenal of moves to learn as you progress through the game, as well as different ways to power up your character's stats and abilities. I also think the game clocks in at a nice time of finishing. My playthrough came in at just about 20 hours, not too short, but not too long either. It also helps that the game doesn't overwhelm you with collectibles. Your main two items are pages and quills, instead of jiggies and notes and banjo, and also the aforementioned health and magic power-ups in each level. Overall, it's a nice bag of stuff. Not too little, but also not Donkey Kong 64 levels of absurd collectibles. So far it sounds like I'm describing a pretty standard fare 3D platformer, right? Well, I am. In fact, I think the game's so evocative of source material that that's where some players have begun to be turned off by it, so let's start digging in there. What's not so good about Yooka Laylee is that, unfortunately, at its worst, Yooka Laylee is really just a victim of its own game design conventions that won't feel like they hold up for many players. What I might perceive as big, expansive levels might come off to others as cumbersome and empty sandboxes that don't exactly beg to be explored. What some see as lighthearted, goofy writing and charming character design could easily be perceived as pointless distractions that just end up slowing down the flow of platforming gameplay. So it seems like there's a rather clear divide, right? Which in turn leads to the mix in consumer reactions that really just boil down to opinion at that point, or player preference. Now, it'd be easy to point the finger at preferential differences as the reason in mixed reactions toward the game, but I think the bigger perpetrator in this case is the game's design philosophy of being a spiritual successor. While the game did set out to be a quote-unquote revival 3D platformer, a throwback game, I think it ended up focusing more on being a throwback than actually really trying to stick it in and be a good solid 3D platformer. It got its priorities mixed up. So the awkward end result is a rather clear split of reactions and opinions in which neither side is inherently wrong, and a game comes out that's only big encompassing flaw is the fact that maybe it's a bit too much like the game it was trying to pay homage to. And it's here that we see the difficult and ambiguous nature of how making a spiritual successor can end up serving as a nostalgia trip for many, but if it's not balanced and improved in the right way, it can also serve as a rude awakening for other players who may not be ready to go back to those somewhat dated and almost archaic design conventions that gaming in general has moved on from. And at the same time, Playtonic Games can't exactly be faulted either, because they delivered the exact product that was promised, a Banjo-Kazooie spiritual successor. Like I said earlier, Yooka Laylee isn't the only example of a spiritual successor. Just a recent one that I discussed with a friend and thought would serve as a good jumping off point for the bigger idea of how to properly balance a spiritual successor. The reason I chose Yooka Laylee, though, was aside from the fact that it's new and I recently finished the game and it's fresh in my mind, its mixed reactions also make it easier to see the awkwardness of a situation in which no party on any side, consumer or developer, is really wrong in how they went about things. Spiritual successors are nothing new to the world of video games. While crowdfunding and digital market spaces have made spiritual successors much more viable to sell, spiritual successors have been coming out for quite some time. To start with some good examples, let's go all the way back to the mid-90s with NBA Hang Time when Midway. They had lost the license to the NBA Jam name and just pretty much made the exact same game but updated it. And that eventually went on to NBA and NBC Showtime and so on and so forth. There's a good team and they had a good idea and they kept going with it. Same thing goes from the team who made Time Splitters, and that's Free Radical, also kind of ironically, coincidentally, X-Rare developers. They built upon the foundation from GoldenEye and Perfect Dark and continued to expand it while creating a compelling and interesting series that unfortunately hasn't seen the light of day in a long time. And then to something more contemporary, we have Rock Band. The first two Guitar Hero games were really popular and successful on the PS2, so they took that idea and incorporated the whole band, which seemed like the next obvious evolution. Unfortunately, the music game market, which is something I'll talk about in some other videos in the future, got oversaturated because of the competition from Activision and Guitar Hero, but still, Rock Band generally tended to be reviewed better than later Guitar Hero games, and it's pretty obvious why. Harmonix, grew the game, and their approach to DLC and the growing digital marketplace was really positively received. And, lastly, for some newer examples, how I mentioned digital marketplaces, we have some more revival kind of games, or games that are trying to pay homage in the same way that Yooka Laylee was. You have Freedom Planet, developed by Galaxy Trail, which is supposed to be a game that evokes not just Sonic, but plenty of old action platformers from the Sega days, Rocket Knight, Comic Zone, Streets of Rage, Kid Chameleon even, plenty of old just Sega classics. It's just good stuff, and it pays great homage to that, but improves upon it in its own way. And lastly, this one might get some flack because it technically isn't out yet, but people who have played the demos of it have said good things, and it's Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which is being made by Koji Igarashi, who's an ex-Konami staffer. If you don't know him, he pretty much made every Castlevania, or at least headed up every Castlevania from Symphony of the Night on to Order of Ecclesia on the DS. Regardless, that looks really hype, and it seems like he's doing a really good job there. So that should end up being a really good time, at least from what people have said based on the demos and the trials they played. What sets these games apart from Yooka Laylee and makes them more endearing to fans, in my opinion, is the fact that instead of just clinging so tight to everything that originally composed their four-bearer projects, including the flaws, these games went the extra step and tried to polish and improve upon the solid foundations already laid out. That's not to say Yooka Laylee is a bad game by any means, it's just that lack of extra polish and improvement that's created such a split among consumers in terms of opinion. In fact, there's a good handful of spiritual successors out there that miss the mark by quite a bit, to the point that they end up with a potentially good idea that just gets wasted because of the fact that it's executed in a game that doesn't complement it at all. For some examples of not so hot spiritual successors, first I'll talk about Bravely Default. I think Bravely Default's an okay game, but for me it kind of ends up being very mediocre and disappointing, and it's a shame because Bravely Default has a very good idea. For starters, those who don't know, it's supposed to be a throwback kind of JRPG in the vein of older Final Fantasy games, like Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, some of the classics that many fans still really love despite some of the new changes. And the game's biggest draw is the fact that its battle system has a lot of great improvements to the old, almost kind of archaic but still tried and true turn-based battle system that JRPGs still sport to this day in some cases, like Dragon Quest. Now, that being said, though, everything else about the game is kind of just mediocre, and I think that's what disappoints me about it, and I think many other people feel the same way. Same for Bravely Second, even though I played less of that. I couldn't tell you the plot of either of those games because it's not memorable. At least in my opinion, it's not. Moving on to another example, though, I could show off Xenosaga on the PS2. That's a series that tried to be more realized than its predecessor, Xenogears on PS1. Like Takashi Tezuka and his team at Monolith Soft left Square, so they couldn't use the Xenogears world or name again. And they tried to hone in on some of the same aesthetic presentations and ideas from Xenogears, but I just don't feel it panned out very well, and I think a lot of other players felt the same way. Just not the same, and he kind of has this habit of creating overly complex worlds, but I think he's learned since then. And then you just get examples of spiritual successors that turn out just bad, either because of development problems or developer ignorance, perhaps would be a way of putting it, like Mighty Number 9. That's a whole web of problems in general to dive into. So I'm not going to speak ill of Inafune. Plenty of people have already said enough about him. But regardless, I think that game's biggest enemy was its development cycle. Making a Mega Man game shouldn't have been hard, even if it's a follow-up. They could have just made a little running red robot instead. I guess that's just Proto Man. But still, that game shouldn't have had as many problems as it did, so that's definitely something on the developer side of it. But then you look at bigger projects like Sonic 06, that game is infamy for being one of the worst Sonic games of all time, but that game is also now noted for having plenty of development rush job problems. So, it's a shame for that, and it was also supposed to be a successor to the Sonic Adventure games. If you play it, you'll see a lot of ideas there, but they just don't hold together well because of development problems. And what arguably makes these games less bearable than Yooka Laylee is the fact that they missed the mark of even being like the games they were trying to invoke in the first place. Sure, it may appear like all the pieces are there in the cases of games like Bravely Default or even Xenosaga, and there may be a strong revised element like the battle system in Bravely Default that I mentioned, but in the end, parts just might not fall into place the way they want to, like in the case of Xenosaga. Or, like the worst case scenarios I mentioned, development issues just arise, like in the cases of Mighty No. 9 and Sonic 06, which kind of dooms the games from the start, and that's just a shame. Oh man, all this elaboration isn't to belittle the idea of the spiritual successor though. In fact, it's an attempt to try and draw attention to it, and hopefully as time passes, allow us to see more positive examples of spiritual successors in the future. At the end of the day, media opinions are subjective, and you can't aim to please everyone when creating a game, but I think that striking a good balance between nostalgia and well-designed ideas from the past, as well as coupling those with all of the positive advancements game design has made over the years, is the best way to create a game that not only acknowledges, but surpasses the quality of its forebears. You don't have to fix what isn't broken, but if there's nothing to be fixed, use that as a reason to build something even more impressive. You've been tuned into Clintellisivision, and those are my thoughts on what I think makes a good spiritual successor. Thanks for stopping by.